Back to our top story then, the news that in the last hour President Trump has been declaring a state of national emergency in the United States. This is really to pay for his border wall with Mexico. Let's get the latest from our correspondent in Washington, Gary O'Donoghue. And Gary, the President saying in his address there at the White House, walls work, he needs the money to pay for the wall. How much is he hoping to get through this declaration of effectively a state of emergency?
So he got $1.4 billion through the normal budgetary process in Congress, the thing that had to be signed by tonight to avoid that government shutdown. He's got that. He was after $5.7 billion as a result of that process, but he didn't get it. And now what he's doing through the national emergency and various other statutory kind of instruments, if you like, he's going elsewhere for the money. He's hoping to get around $8 billion altogether, just over $8 billion, which he says he'll direct at border walls spending and other security measures down there. That in fact means he has to go and raid other pots of money that have already been allocated to things like infrastructure spending in the military, to drug interdiction programs, other areas too. And so that's going to cause a row, particularly because it's in this country, it's Congress that gets to decide how the money's raised and where it's spent. And so that's a key constitutional question here. And indeed, the President himself, Ben, said in the Rose Garden speech that he expected to be sued straight away, it to go through the courts, he'd lose a couple of times and it would end up at the Supreme Court. So he's already played that game in his own head and understands, I'm sure, that he may well not get to spend any of this money anytime soon.
The Democrats are saying this is a gross abuse of power. Some of them are saying it's unconstitutional. It's certainly a rare move, a controversial move. Is it unconstitutional?
Well, there is a power of national emergency. There's a National Emergencies Act that the President is invoking on this occasion. That's been done more than 50 times since it came in the 1970s. It's normally been for things like post 9/11, for sanctions, for other threats to the state, and it doesn't often involve this sort of infrastructure spending. And many people say, well, look, you know, where is this national emergency? The numbers coming over the border now are much lower than they were 10 or 20 years ago, and all that kind of thing. So there's that argument, but also I think what you'll see is Congress, certainly the Democrats in Congress, say, look, there is constitutional issues involved here. We get to choose how the money is raised and spent, and so there will be resolutions put through there, I'm sure. They will probably fall in the Senate, where the Republican leader has done a 180-degree U-turn and come out in favour of the national emergency, so it may not get through there. But he's not just going to face legal problems, is what I'm saying to you. There's going to be legislative problems as well. And of course, from his supporters, if this all gets bogged down in those processes and the wall is not getting built, he'll come under pressure from those conservative commentators who speak in some sense on behalf of the core vote, who likes this idea very much.
Yeah, and is all this talk from the President about the wall, this continuing talk, is this an appeal effectively to his political base? As he said in his statement there at the White House, this was his core campaign promise.
Yes, I mean, look, from the President's point of view, he says there's a national security crisis at the border. He says the country is being invaded by drugs and people traffickers and illegal immigrants. That is his position, whether you disagree with it or whether you think it's justified or not. But it is also true that this is an enormously politically important thing for him. He fought the campaign largely on this. He fought the midterm elections largely on this as well, and got thumped by losing 40 seats in the House of Representatives. But it is something, it's become totemic, if you like, amongst his supporters, as something that he has promised he will do to stop these issues happening. And if he doesn't do it, that will be something that will sit in their minds coming up to the next election.
Gary, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Gary O'Donoghue there for us, our correspondent in Washington. And our latest headlines now on BBC News. President Trump has confirmed he will invoke emergency powers to pay for his border wall with Mexico. Holly, thank you very much indeed. Now back to our main news this evening. President Trump declaring a national emergency over the US border with Mexico, trying to bypass Congress and to secure funding for his border wall. Well, he was speaking in the last couple of hours at the White House, and he said that the United States is facing an invasion of drugs, people traffickers and criminals. The president said he expects to face legal challenges to his invoking a national emergency, but he also said he hopes the courts will give him a fair hearing. Well, we're going to discuss these latest dramatic political developments in Washington with the Amy Pope, who's a former US Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, who's now an Associate Fellow at the US and the Americas Program at Chatham House. Welcome to you. And also I'm joined by Sebastian Gorka, who served as Deputy Assistant to US President Donald Trump in 2017. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Sebastian Gorka, maybe I could ask you first of all, is this genuinely a national emergency? Because back in 2017 was actually the lowest number of apprehensions on the US-Mexico border since 1971. So how is it worse now than it was back then?
I'm not sure where you're getting your statistics from.
Well, the US Customs and Border Protection Agency is the source.
Let me quote you what we had for the last calendar year. We had 390,000 illegal aliens apprehended at the border. That's almost 500,000. That is a national crisis. On another metric, we had 72,000 Americans die from drug overdoses of fentanyl and opioids that were smuggled across mostly the southern border. That is a multiple of how many Americans were killed in the Vietnam War. Just that alone provides more than adequate justification for the president to do what he did today.
But if it's 500,000 now, if it's 500,000 now, as you say, in the year 2000, and this is according to the US Customs and Border Protection Agency, so presumably they should know, 2000 it was 1.6 million. So if it's a national emergency now, surely it was a national emergency back then, well, 3 times, 4 times a national emergency.
Yes, so what's your point?
Well, the point is, previous Republican presidents didn't declare emergency powers, and this one is.
We have declared, Democrat and Republican presidents have declared more than 50 national emergencies since 1977. President Obama declared one because of the quality of drinking water in Flint, Michigan. He declared one on avian bird flu. So this is, you know, the idea that this is something untoward, outre, or unusual is totally fallacious. There are 31 national emergencies extant today, some of them going back to 1979 and the Iranian crisis. So if you're trying to make the argument that this is unusual, then history does not support your argument.
Okay, Amy Pope, well, you were, as I was saying, US Deputy Homeland Advisor to President Obama. Now, President Trump says that the United States is currently facing an invasion of drugs, people traffickers and criminals. So this is a national emergency. He has to build this wall. He says walls work, and he's going to build this wall with money from his emergency powers.
I'm afraid he just doesn't have the facts to support that argument. If you look, for example, at the El Chapo trial, right, that just happened in New York, you saw that El Chapo ran an organization that was extraordinarily sophisticated. They used border tunnels. They used submarines. They used aerial devices to get the drugs across the border. So if the president believes that a wall is going to be an effective deterrent against serious organized crime, then I think he's mistaken.
He was saying, actually, the wall in Israel works. 99.9%. The wall in Israel has worked. Why shouldn't it work in the United States?
Because when you look at the problems that we're seeing at the border, for example, the Central American people who are fleeing violence and seeking asylum with U.S. Customs and Border officials, they won't be stopped by a wall. So it's time for the president to take a good look at what's actually happening at the border and come up with solutions that will fit the problems.
What solutions like what?
Technology, sharing of information between Customs and Border officials, Department of Justice officials, other officials, having sophisticated detection at the ports of entry, making sure there are sufficient immigration judges to hear the cases. There is a long list that may be more appropriate here, but the president, for whatever reason, has chosen not to focus on it.
Sebastian Gorka, technology and a long list of alternatives to a wall. What do you say to that?
I'd like to know if Ms. Pope lives in a tent or if she lives in a house with walls. If she lives in a house with walls, do the walls work? When she goes to bed at night, does she lock her front door, or does she leave it wide open and say, it's okay, I've got technology, you can come in here? It is asinine. Walls, of course, they work. That's why we've had them for the history of mankind, since the first flint piece of stone was laid upon another flint piece of stone.
Okay, well, let's put that to Amy Pope. Walls work.
Well, in the medieval days, certainly they worked, and that was an appropriate solution. But we are no longer living at that moment in time. It's time for the president to look at where we are and to come to terms with the real facts on the border. Yeah. And I think that's why you don't see the support within the Republican Party for this solution.
Sebastian Gorka, let me just ask you this, though. In terms of paying for this wall, I mean, at first Donald Trump...
I'd still like to know, does Amy Pope live in a tent?
Well, I think we can assume she doesn't live in a tent. I think that's fair to assume.
Well, then walls work, don't they? It's not just the Middle Ages, is it?
Let me just ask you this, though, Sebastian Gorka. Initially, Donald Trump said Mexico was going to pay for this wall. He seemed to give up on that idea. Then he was going to get Congress to pay for this wall. They wouldn't pay for it. So is this now a rather desperate gambit, which he may well lose in the courts, to get this money, $8 billion or whatever it's going to cost, through his national emergency powers?
Well, quite the contrary. If you remember, Speaker Pelosi so arrogantly just 2 weeks ago said, I'm not even going to give Donald Trump $1. Well, yesterday she promised to give him over $1 billion, and thanks to his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, we've actually found $8 billion, almost twice the amount the president first requested from Congress. And there's nothing desperate about it. I was in the White House when the Democrats in the crazy Ninth Circuit challenged us on our travel ban. And what did we do? We went through the whole court system, we took every challenge, and we won that fight in the Supreme Court, and the travel ban was upheld.
But you're going to have to take some money from the military under these emergency powers. You're going to have to take money from flood defense, emergency flood defenses in places like Florida. You're going to rob Peter to pay Paul in a way.
Not at all. So the Department of Agriculture by itself, the Department of Agriculture, has $200 billion worth of outstanding loans to private entities in America. That is 10 times the cost of the full southern border barrier. So, no, this isn't robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are the richest nation in the world. Okay. This can be done very easily without undermining our defensive capabilities with one win.
Amy Pope, this can be afforded, and also, do you think the Democrats who are talking about taking this to court, maybe all the way to the Supreme Court, are they going to be able to successfully challenge Donald Trump on this, do you think? Absolutely.
Look, the president is overreaching his executive powers. The Constitution makes clear that it's Congress that has the power of the purse. And they did so, the Constitution does so for a reason. It's meant to curtail the president's power and to make sure that there is consensus over very significant policy issues. That's what we're seeing in play right now, and I think that's a good thing.
He did, by the way, campaign, I mean, the wall was his key campaign promise, and he won the election. So some people would say this is democracy. He campaigned for a wall on the promise of a wall. This is what he's trying to give the American people.
Unfortunately, he just doesn't have the votes, and that's the way the American system works. If you have a great idea and you get the votes to support it, terrific. But when you don't get the votes, you don't get your wall, and that's what he's seeing right now.
All right, good to talk to both of you. Thank you so much, Sebastian Gorka and Amy Pope. Many thanks indeed for your time.